Hello, welcome, bienvenido, ahlan wa sahlan. Today I'm going to do something that I've only done once before on my Arabic channel, which is a video response to a critique of my videos. My subs over on the other channel told me it was a pointless waste of time to give such apologists any attention, and I'm in two minds whether or not it is a good use of my time in general. I know it's entertainment for some, but it keeps me from actually doing new videos, so I'll probably be quite selective in the future, and I'll try to get through the ones which actually sound like they have an argument to make. Let me just say before I get any further, I don't intend on responding to responses back and forth. I may only respond to a response to my video. I will not give them unlimited attention and make it endless. I know some people out there love to have the last word, thinking those who do have the last word automatically win an argument. But I'm not going to respond to their response to my response to their response of my video. That would just be ridiculous. I have better things to do with my life than endlessly engage with chronic attention seekers. So a response settles it in my opinion, as I'm not one to give their mental gymnastics and deceptions any more time than they deserve. Unless of course they actually present a strong argument for once, in which case I'll keep it brief and say fair play in the comment of that video, and correct anything I need to correct. Otherwise, going back and forth with desperate apologists can get very tedious and is an unnecessary waste of time for me and for my viewers. So today I'll start going through a couple of videos posted by a person calling himself iJihad who wants to refute my ISIS and Islam series, and that's going to be a tough task, so let's wish him luck. Given that he has critiqued my 3 opening videos of the series in his videos called iJihad 4 and iJihad 5, I'll be responding to these in 3 separate videos, each one responding to his specific response to each of my videos. So this one will be responding to the first video I did, and then the second, and then the third. The iJihadi's videos total around 2 hours in duration combined, and if I were to respond to all of them in a single video, then the video would be extremely long and not many people would have the stamina to sit through it all. Now, this guy has been hyping himself up for months and months that he's going to be doing a so-called quote-unquote refutation to my series. In August last year, he said he was halfway through refuting most of my videos. When he eventually produced one several months later, it was so incredibly poor, it was... how can I put this? Basically, it was a textbook example of how to waffle on pretentiously for about an hour without actually saying much. On top of this, he tried to play the role of a psychic conspiracy theorist as well, by trying to, quote-unquote, expose my evil hidden intentions. So he tried to constantly smear my character rather than approach the rebuttal in a respectable professional manner. It was nothing short of a desperate attempt at character assassination, and Asadullah the iJihadi should be the last one to make smear attacks. He's the typical brat living in a glass house throwing stones at everyone else. The only people who need to use insults and smears in their arguments are those unable to win over any intellectuals out there. So they dumb down and go for the gullible Muslim teenagers instead, who think a Muslim response to anything automatically equates to a quote-unquote refutation, unable to distinguish between a rebuttal and an actual refutation. It's the same gullible crowd that acts as fanbots to cheer on obnoxious, arrogant individuals who can only always respond to criticism of their positions with childish insults. It's often a little too early for them to understand how respectable people communicate and engage in discussion, and it's quite common for them to use words such as wrecked, pawned, destroyed, owned, or you've been refuted in it. So if I do decide to make this a thing going forward, it'll be part of the Refuted in It series here on this channel TMA, where I allegedly get wrecked, destroyed, pawned, and owned, and the Muslim making the argument thinks he looks like this, when in fact he often looks a lot more like this. I understand that my audience is smart enough to figure out how deceptive and disingenuous apologists generally are, so this response is aimed more at young impressionable Muslim teens who are unfortunately slowly getting dragged into the abyss of a horrendous cult and getting tribalistic and giddy at what they see as an us versus them world. Let's not increase the anti-apostate bigotry that is so rampant among the Muslim community. In the past, I've responded to people who have offered rebuttals in video form in the comment section of those videos. And I did so immediately after they had posted their video because they made their arguments in a somewhat respectable manner, deserving my attention, arguing over the substance and not trying to smear me every 5 seconds. They had confidence in their arguments and didn't need ad hominem attacks peppered in constantly to try and appear to the gullible as if they were somehow intellectually superior to the rest of humanity. I therefore responded in an equally respectful manner, because it's great if we can show people that we can disagree without being childish morons, creating drama for the sake of gaining attention. This apologist, however, has taken an extremely juvenile and slanderous approach in his ridiculous effort to try and discredit my work. He moves beyond solely addressing my arguments, to instead attacking my character endlessly. By looking briefly at his track record, he appears to be a chronic attention seeker who tries to gain some relevance by attacking atheist YouTubers. He had years of drama with Thunderfoot under his old username Dawahfilms. He tried to get more attention by attacking people like Kraut and T and Sargon of Akkad. I'm used to these smears and ad-hom attacks, but I just don't find any personal attacks very constructive, and I would normally just ignore apologists like the iJihadi. But he does make some points which may seem valid on the surface, but a bit of scrutiny shows them to be a lot of thin air and really lacking in substance. Not everything he says is invalid, by the way. He raises at least one point in the next video where I'm happy to concede that he's added more useful information to the way I raised it. That's because I'm not stubborn or driven by an ego. Even if a child makes a fair point, I will grant it. Speaking of children, I've seen plenty of childish comments and video titles by the iJihadi's fanbase, so it'll be interesting to have a quick read of his comments section to try and figure out what kind of audience he's making content for. Okay, let's have a look what we have here. Alright, iJihad, the Masked Arab one. First things first, you know what we need to do? Give him a thumbs up. Hey. No, I'm kidding. I'm just kidding. There we go. Down here we have a couple of channels who are asking if they can mirror this video. Here we have probably the most popular comment on this page. It says, mask off, check it, mask off, 70 thumbs up. That just sounds like I'm at a strip club or something. Let's see somebody's reply to this. Oh dear, somebody's been deleting the replies on their channel. Yeah, look. There was a reply, but now it's mysteriously gone. I wonder what happened there. Next one we have Sara Ab. Alhamdulillah alladhi adhara al-haq. There we go. We've got a spelling error there. Should be the va and not the dod. Next, Abu Muhammad Ali Al-Ansari. Every dog has his day. Today is the day of Masked Arab. Okay. Woof woof. So, yeah. Now we have President Donald J. Trump coming in saying nice. Alright. Very nice. Let's see. View reply. Thanks for watching, Mr. President. Okay. Al-Muslim S here from Saudi Arabia. I was waiting so long for such a video to be made. Thank you, brother. Thumbs up from a Sharia student from KSA. That's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. A Sharia student there. Probably just finished a lesson where he learnt exactly how to chop off people's hands and exactly how to stone them to death. Moving on. Mustafa Sahin. Masked Arab got smoked. I bet he fainted watching the first 12 minutes. LOL. I was waiting for this. Thank Allah you made the video. Love your vids. Monotheistic person. There is no such thing as intellectual ex-Muslim. This is the biggest myth. A sincere Muslim will search rationally according to the values, standards, blah blah blah, not through a blind emotional affection to other ideologies, cultures, or differences in moral values. Let's see the reply. Again, reply missing. Joey Tribbiani. Edgelord got steamrolled. That's the first time anybody's ever referred to me as an edgelord. Okay. His whole thing, the presentation, the arguments, the inconsistencies, the style, everything is so potato. That's very vague. Like at 36 minutes 53 seconds when he says an authentic narration from Muhammad, but it says right on the screen it was narrated by Amr bin Shu'aib. Ha 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 ha. He's shooting from the hip to the point that he can't even get the plain obvious straight. So this guy has actually tried to give us an argument. Let's see if I've actually made a mistake. And if I did, that's fine. People make mistakes. So what's he saying? He's given a timestamp so we can actually double check this. 36:53 when he says an authentic narration from Muhammad, but it says right on the screen it was narrated by Amr bin Shu'aib. Are not to be punished as murderers. The Messenger of Allah said. Oh wow. Okay. Can you read? This is incredible. This is unbelievable. It was narrated from Amr ibn Shu'aib, from his father, from his grandfather, that the Messenger of Allah said, blah blah blah. So it says here, the Messenger of Allah said. Yet this guy seems to think that the Messenger of Allah is not Muhammad. Or he just can't read properly. Or maybe he just simply doesn't understand how hadiths work. See, when Muhammad says something, he tells someone, in this case it was Amr ibn Shu'aib's grandfather, who then tells someone, his father, who then tells someone, Amr ibn Shu'ayb in this instance, and only then would the hadith reach one of the hadith collectors like Bukhari or Muslim. You will never ever find a hadith that's direct from Muhammad to Bukhari, because Bukhari lived way after Muhammad died. So the Muslims following this guy seem to be absolutely clueless about the most basic elements of their own religion. In fairness, I don't know if that's the case. Let's see if anybody has responded to this guy. Maybe somebody has set him straight and said, hang on a second, you've just had a massive error. There we go. 12 likes and no replies. Yeah, I mean, you've got 12 thumbs up and nobody even bothered checking. Or we can maybe conclude that a sizable portion of your audience have absolutely no idea about the basic structures of hadith. And here we've got TMA just got wrecked with the K. I always like the wrecked with the K. Anyway, let's move on. So, having read the comments, we can see he doesn't have the most sophisticated following on YouTube. In fact, it appears the comment section may have an average age of around 12 or 13. Not all of them, of course, present this juvenile schoolyard mentality, and we know we can find trolls on all kinds of videos. Yet, I think his most vocal supporters seem to also be the most childish, which means you'll never really be able to have a constructive conversation before they all slide in. So please note, whenever I'm referring to his viewers in this video, I'm going to be referring to the obnoxious juvenile ones, not the ones who are happy to have a civilized discussion. And for that reason, I'll be a little out of character and take away some of the element of respect I usually show to my critics. I've never really called them idiots, morons, imbeciles in the past, preferring to focus entirely on their arguments. But I do feel this particular apologist needs to be played at his own game to some degree in order to get through to some of his fanbots who will cheer on their side no matter how incoherent or intellectually vacuous an argument actually is. I'll be watching this video in full for the first time. I've previously only seen snippets, but enough to understand his incredibly sly deceptive tactics. Going through his Twitter account, I found this tweet. If a response is made to iJihad, which is this video, this is what I'm expecting. 1. Evasion. 2. Character assassination. Just a good prediction. Wink. Wow. The irony. Bear this tweet in mind as you listen to this video, and understand that he wrote this after publishing the very video where he does little else besides those two things. He constantly evades the substance by avoiding crucial parts of my video. He also evades points in my video by running off to other verses to try and find something vague that he can reinterpret to try and prove his point, often with verses that are already abrogated. And the character assassination, as you'll see, is off the charts. The lack of self-awareness with this particular apologist is astonishing. Going through his Twitter a bit more, we can see not only that he likes his own video on his own channel, but that he also goes around liking all the mirrors of his own video. Wow. I can never understand people who write a post or make a video and then like it themselves. It just seems super desperate. Though in fairness, the narcissism isn't that surprising though, given it's from a person who idolizes a mythological narcissistic figure who allegedly constantly pats himself on the back for his alleged creation, demanding to be worshipped and praised night and day. If you feel like feeding into his ego, you have a link to his video in the description box and a couple of mirrors. He needs his likes like a man needs his nugs. The so-called Islamophobes are already disliking it, and we don't want him to be too upset. I initially planned to save myself the effort and have my youngest child, whose age is still in the single digits by the way, destroy the iJihadi, who is championing himself on Twitter as every Islamophobe's nightmare. Honestly, I don't know how he could have said that without actually thinking how much of a joke he is. I am not kidding you. This is not photoshopped. This is his actual Twitter bio. So for a guy who likes to arrogantly tout himself up in this cringy way, it seems we'd be doing him a favour by bringing his ridiculous ego down a few notches and having him schooled by a young child. And trust me, he would have been destroyed by the kid. We could have titled the video Asadullah Ali Al-Andalusi schooled by a young child. We could have had this as a thumbnail, and it would be speaking to his audience. I then found out after some research that this particular apologist, Asadullah Ali Al-Andalusi, previously known as Dawahfilms, likes to take his disagreements with people who criticize Islam to psychopathic levels if you engage with him enough. So I thought I'd spare my child from potential death threats and potential doxing. This is a clip from Thunderfoot's channel exposing this guy's fanatical nature.
Yet this is the full quote. There is no effort to mine this, to put it in a false light in order to change the meaning. This is the full quote. And I'll be frank, the hate and spite in this guy's facial expressions says it all. Just look at the eyes.
Thunderfoot, and people who think like you. If you ever try to awaken any sort of sleeping giant that is hostile to any Muslim or non-Muslim innocent person, as mandated in the Quran and the true interpretation of the Sharia that all true Muslims and the majority of the Muslims in the world share, we Muslims, the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and our non-Muslim allies will send you to the God that you wish you knew. Not as a threat, not as a promise, but a mandate of justice.
Thunderfoot also provides this clip which Asadullah made for him, where he finds out his name and where he works and doxes him to the Muslims in his immediate vicinity.
After 40 or so million video views of a all but anonymous voice making arguments, primarily for the reason that a good argument stands on its merits, not on my qualifications, it was a Muslim guy who hunted for my docs for months and then when he finally got them, spread them around, including informing an Islamic group where I work.
I also wonder what the Muslim Student Association on that campus would believe about a faculty member endorsing these sort of bigoted opinions, which is why I sent every single one of them your videos, your statements, with your name attached.
Now, if it isn't painfully obvious, this apologist could have gotten Thunderfoot murdered, simply for being critical against Islam. Apparently the fanatic claims Thunderfoot advocated genocide in order to justify his atrocious behaviour. He's yet to prove that claim. Besides, let's imagine for a second he in fact did. The complaints should be to law enforcement officials, not sending emails informing the Muslims around him to do with the information presented to them as they please. Wink wink. This was only a few years ago, and it's not like the apologist had never heard of Muslim attitudes to things like Charlie Hebdo and Salman Rushdie, and was naive to the presence of sleeper cells and lone wolves everywhere. Even within the general Muslim population, we know how many people supported the death sentence against people like Salman Rushdie, who simply wrote a novel, and how many people would be more than happy to kill who they regard as blasphemers. The tone in which he says this is appalling too, trying his best to intimidate Thunderfoot with his disgusting threats. Just listen to it again.
I also wonder what the Muslim Student Association on that campus would believe about a faculty member endorsing these sort of bigoted opinions, which is why I sent every single one of them your videos, your statements, with your name attached.
This isn't the tone of someone looking to win an argument purely on intellect. When you send the Muslims near Thunderfoot his name and links to his videos, what on earth are you trying to achieve that doesn't end in violence? Do you want them to discuss Islam with him gently and politely? You could do that yourself online. We can tell by your tones what your intentions were. Luckily for Thunderfoot, the Muslims near him were probably far better human beings than the crazy convert who calls for the destruction of human rights in his blog. Yes, he's that type of guy. Just a wonderful moderate all round. Link to his article, if you have a few brain cells to spare, can be found in the description box. He'll probably portray this as some kind of character assassination, but I'm not suggesting this has anything to do with his arguments. His arguments have to be judged exclusively far from his deranged nature, and we will get to them. This is just so others out there are fully aware of what kind of person they're dealing with before they decide on whether or not they should engage with him in discussion. If he's not threatening you with violence and you engage with him in debate, you'll probably just get blocked, as this person found out after about 15 minutes of engaging with him on Twitter. Let's address his video then, which goes on for more than an hour, bit by bit, and his original is linked in the description box if anyone wants to check out his original masterpiece minus my commentary. By the way, if you hate lengthy videos and you want to get to the summary, skip to the time you see on screen now. I'll link to that part of the video in the description box so it's easier to get to it quickly by clicking on a link instead of sliding through the timeline to get there. So let's start the iJihad video. Okay, straight off the bat, that's annoying. This guy thinks he's doing a proper television production for the BBC. It's just a rebuttal. Keep it nice and simple. It's like he's trying to win an Emmy for this. No wonder it's an hour long.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome back to another episode of iJihad, a web series dedicated to deconstructing anti-Islam polemics while providing our audience with the most accurate information on Islam and the Muslim world. I'm your host, the narrator, and this is my sidekick, Abu Ren. Today we will be analyzing a set of videos from a popular ex-Muslim YouTuber that goes by the name of The Masked Arab.
I wouldn't say it's a large following relative to YouTube standards, but I'm not complaining, especially as I sometimes take an entire year between videos, so I'm quite fortunate to have the following I have.
Hey Abu, why don't you fetch me the case file on our next target? Thanks. Alright, let's see here. So the Masked Arab has gained a large following due to being an ex-Muslim who happens to critique Islam.
Okay, let's just read this case file, shall we? Got my name wrong, but you're going by my YouTube username given my anonymity. Fair enough. Probably more accurate to say name unknown and put the Masked Arab down as an alias. Age 30 plus. Now this is worrying. I hardly ever reveal my age, and I have never said my age in a video on my channel. So maybe I've mentioned it a few times in random comments or tweets that are months or years apart. I think we definitely have a bit of an obsessive stalker here, if you know that info. Gender fluid. Wow, hilarious. About as original as a Yo Mama joke. But in fairness, I guess he also understands his target audience are impressionable little Muslim kids and teenagers. So fair play. These jokes will get you more of those sophisticated subs. Height and weight unknown. Surprised you didn't just write midget for height and fatso for weight. Surely a missed opportunity at making your audience chuckle. Race Arab. Again, missed opportunity. Your audience probably would have preferred to see Filthy Jew as an answer here instead. Rank Kipling's poster child. We can see the creativity juices have come to a halt by this stage. And the short bio. Let's have a look. After years of confusion, the masked Arab decided to apostate from Islam. Seeking a new purpose in life, he put on a mask to save the credulous masses from his own confusion. So, according to his insightful analysis, I put on a mask to save what he calls the credulous masses from my own confusion. Yet we have no explanation what effect anonymity has on any of this. Also, it's quite astonishing how much projection this guy has. I was sent this post by someone. The iJihadi on Facebook tells his followers that he's preparing another video on me, but his incoherent post confused at least one of his followers. And so this short bio seems to apply pretty well for him and his followers.
He is most well known for arguing that ISIS is a near-perfect representation of Islamic teachings. So we intend to examine his videos in depth, revealing their numerous errors and fallacious logic. Admittedly, however, this is going to be quite difficult, because it seems that all one needs to do these days to be granted supreme authority on a religion is to be an ex-follower of that religion. In other words, we are not as privileged as the masked Arab to have these magical powers conferred upon us by the credulous masses. So we'll have to rely on these inconsequential things called facts in order to make our case.
Let's all remember what he's just said here. He claims he'll use facts. Let's hold him to that.
Now, to be fair, the masked Arab does attempt to present authentic sources throughout his videos.
I like how he says, to be fair. Trust me, if you were fair, you would have left Islam a long time ago and would have thanked me or anyone else who spent any time and effort snapping you out of your delusion on your way out.
That said, he does so in a purposefully selective manner, twisting those sources to suit his own agenda so as to deceive his audience. Now, if you don't believe me, that's perfectly fine, because by the end of this episode, you will. You see, we will be using the very same sources as the masked Arab to prove this accusation. That's right, the very same sources, links and all. There will be no mental gymnastics on display here, no excuses and no apologetics. Nope, just some good old reading comprehension and a love for integrity. And as always, we will provide full academic references.
So here he accuses me of deception, and he says it with such arrogance it might sound convincing to the simplest of simpletons out there, who are affected and swayed by such ad hominem smear attacks. I won't make the same accusation of him for now, but we'll very soon see who the deceptive one really is, and I'll remind you of my track record in intellectual honesty. Also, let's keep track of his claim that he won't use mental gymnastics, excuses, or apologetics. He doesn't seem to understand what they mean because the video is jam-packed with excuses, and the fact that he's making a rebuttal to this video attacking his religion is in itself apologetics. It's not necessarily a bad term, but he doesn't seem to understand these basic English words. He says he has good old reading comprehension and a love for integrity. We'll see about that. But right off the bat, it seems your English comprehension isn't the best, as you don't understand what an apologist actually is. Don't get me wrong, he's generally quite well spoken, and that's the extent of his appeal. But let's just take a quick look at the definition of apologist, shall we? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as one who speaks or writes in defense of someone or something. Just own the title, don't shy away from it, it's what you're doing here. He kind of reminds me a little of Will Ferrell's character, Gator, who was in denial that he was a pimp.
The university I went to decided they needed to raise tuition. A classmate of mine, Brenda, in an effort to raise money and stay in school, came up with a nifty plan where she thought she'd date guys and charge them money.
I go on dates all the time with a whole bunch of, boys and stuff. And I kind of need somebody to help me out, like, my partner in crime.
Yeah, I could make a schedule.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Provide transportation services.
Yeah. Give me a good time.
Thanks so much for asking. She said she needed my help to make sure that the dates went okay and that the guys paid her. She said she'd give me a percentage. Oh my God, you were a pimp. What? God, no. No, I was just trying to help a friend. She started making a lot of money. And wouldn't you know it, some of Brenda's girlfriends decided they wanted to be a part of it. Pretty soon, there were about 14 ladies that I was protecting while they gave me money. That's called a stable horse. We decided I shouldn't use my real name. So we came up with the name Gator. I'm telling you, you were a pimp. No! Are you even listening to the story?
Now, in order to do this, we will need to begin by looking at the first two videos of the Masked Arab series on Islam and ISIS. The first video deals with terrorism and extremism, and the second with killing innocent civilians. Now, these two videos are essentially the same. However, what makes them particularly notable is that they are the foundation for the rest of the series. In other words, if significant errors can be found in these videos, then dominoes will fall.
Wow, he claims that they're the foundation for the rest of the series. Says who? Says the iJihadi? Why would they be the foundation for the rest of the series? Each topic has its own video. This is a guy who likes to impress his gullible audience by stating that he studied philosophy and repeating the word fallacy every few minutes to make it sound like what we just saw was indeed a fallacy. We'll soon see he's the king of fallacies, especially when it comes to red herrings and straw man arguments. But here he's starting with such a huge facepalm moment by suggesting that the rest of the videos will fall because of what he suggests may be significant errors in these videos. No rational human would make such a ridiculous composition fallacy like that with a straight face. Every topic is independent of the next, but let's say for a second that it indeed meant dominoes will fall, and by extension, the whole series was false in its entirety. As a result, does he even understand what this means? It means that everything I said was wrong, and that ISIS do actually represent Islam clearly in some instances, as my series provides exceptions where I don't feel ISIS is following Islam closely and bending scripture to suit its agenda. Statements that he's deliberately left out so far, as we'll soon see, to deceive his audience yet again. I make that distinction in the suicide bombings video and the child soldiers video, and to some degree in others too. So by this logic, the apologist has just told us that my ISIS series is wrong, which means Islam does clearly allow suicide bombings of civilians and clearly endorses the use of child soldiers. Also, when you're attacking my integrity and attacking my intellectual honesty and claiming that I'm deceptive, you failed to tell your viewers that I've in fact not reached a conclusion that ISIS is Islamic on every single thing they do. I've tried to be as fair as I could, but I'm coming at it from an objective perspective, whereas you're a Muslim who can never admit that anything whatsoever is wrong with Islam. You'll have to just make excuses all the time, 24/7. Anyway, let's congratulate Mr. iJihadi. Your embarrassing fallacy right at the outset of this hour-long video has concluded that ISIS is in fact Islamic when it comes to some of the most horrific things it does. It took you a grand total of 3 minutes, which included the cringy intro and childish case file, by the way, to commit a massive logical fallacy and shoot yourself in the foot at the same time without even realizing it. But remember, this guy has awarded himself with the prestigious title, Every Islamophobe's Nightmare. Anyway, at this rate, we will never get to the end of the video, so I'll just have to let him off the hook on a lot. And that's just so we can finish the video off eventually.
As for those of you who may complain about the length of this episode, allow me to invoke Brandolini's law. The amount of energy needed to refute nonsense is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it.
You could seriously have made this a 5-minute video and you could have put in every single point you make. You literally have about a 5 or 6 minute outro, as you'll see. Even what he regards as substance has no point to it besides being a collection of red herrings and strawmen. Also, we can apply Brandolini's law to Muslims as well, can't we? You say God did it for most scientific phenomena, whereas the atheist will present lengthy evidence and lots of data, taking you through the entire process to make you understand how the natural world works without requiring a magical being who wants you to worship him, or else he burns you forever and ever whilst sitting on a throne that's above water. When it comes to apologetics, however, if you're going down the route of telling us Islam is incredibly complicated and has to be looked at in a very complex way in order to be understood, then you're simply telling us your Prophet Muhammad was absolutely bad at his job. He was supposed to be a messenger of the most important message in human history. Yet it seems to be the one religion in the entire world that has been so misunderstood to spawn so much violence through its followers than any other in human history. If Islam was indeed peaceful at its core, then the message wasn't delivered clearly at all, and that means Muhammad failed miserably at his one job.
So, without further ado, let's begin, shall we?
Oh man, this is slow. No need for these super slow graphic transitions. Just get to the substance already. So, let's begin in this video with issue number 1. Oh dear. Now the first thing you should ask is this. Why on earth has this apologist not started at the outset of my video? What is he hiding? I, on the other hand, have started at the start of his video, not missing a single frame. I may skip some film clips he adds in for comedy or speed up his slow graphics a bit, but we'll listen to everything he says. So why has the iJihadi started playing my video at the 3-minute 10-second mark? Has he missed anything out that completely invalidates his entire arguments and videos from the outset? Has he done this on purpose because he's deceptive? Something he's had the audacity of accusing me of? I don't know. Maybe it was deliberate. Maybe he missed it because his reading comprehension, something he says he's great at, was in fact not that great. So let's take a look at the first 6 seconds of my video that he's responding to. Now that's a warning message because the content is not necessarily for everyone. Okay, let's pause there. Only 5 seconds into my video and I explain exactly what I'm doing with the video series. Let's read it, shall we, since the iJihadi never showed you this because it invalidates his entire video. This series looks at whether or not the Islamic State group, ISIS, can justify their actions in any way from primary Islamic sources. That sentence speaks for itself. See, unlike the Quran, my sentences are clear and the message is obvious. I'm saying here that I want to see whether or not ISIS can justify their actions in any way from primary Islamic sources. You could never refute that. You can say, let's look at what this particular exegesis says instead, or you can say, let's skip 50 pages in front or 30 pages behind to read another quote and see whether we find contradictions, but the original quotes and teachings remain. I never once said that everything ISIS does is exactly #TrueIslam is at its core. Even in this video, as we'll see in a moment, I make that very clear. But my money is on the iJihadi being incredibly deceptive yet again, banking on a largely ignorant audience, not making the effort to cross-check his constant smear attacks. So what we have here is an absolute huge straw man from the very outset that he builds his entire refutation series on altogether. His videos are now completely debunked as he's set himself to respond to a straw man because he chose to completely ignore the beginning of the video, which sets out the aim of the series. Let's continue with my video and see what else he missed. Now, I say this because I don't want people to have negative perceptions about random individual Muslims, because most are actually ignorant to the intricacies of what their faith teaches, having been fed a somewhat sanitized version. The next slide says, I'm clearly not saying all Muslims do this or believe this. Let me just skip the rest of the intro, which are just some clips of ISIS in action, and head to the beginning. Hello and welcome to the first episode of this series. Practically everybody now is aware of the Islamic State terrorist group that has established an Islamic caliphate across large parts of Iraq and Syria. Their violence and barbarity has shocked the world, and they're doing it all in the name of Islam. But just how Islamic are their actions? Muslims who don't side with Islamic State and even some non-Muslims have claimed the group has absolutely nothing to do with Islam. Okay, so here, conveniently ignored by the iJihadi once more, is a clip of me in that very video he partially responds to, where I say I'm debunking the claim that ISIS has, quote, absolutely nothing to do with Islam. If you want to argue that they have absolutely nothing to do with Islam, then you're simply deluding yourself. Even the iJihadi in this video agrees pretty much with a lot of violence I mention, making excuses for it, as we'll see a little later. This generation's top political leaders, starting with George W. Bush, have attempted to portray Islam as a religion of peace. They claim that it's a religion that couldn't be further in its core teachings from the actions of terrorists worldwide. This narrative has now spread like wildfire. So in this series, we'll look into all the things that the Islamic State group does and look through Islam's primary textual sources like the Quran, authentic hadiths, Muhammad's biography, or the opinions of top Islamic jurisprudence scholars, and see whether the actions of this group have any legitimacy based on reading and analyzing these Islamic sources. I will hopefully be uploading an episode per week during the series, probably around Friday, and at the end of it, I'll combine them all into a very long video which can be used as a one-stop reference video to clarify whether what ISIS does has precedence within Islamic texts or not. You will also find in the description box of this video links to all the Islamic sources I cite in the video, so no one has to take my word for anything I say. Just go to the links and read them for yourself. For those who wish to claim that Islamic texts cannot be translated accurately, please go and watch this video in Arabic where I make the same arguments without using a single translation. I will be breaking down this series into the following sections you see on screen. Some of these topics will overlap. For example, beheadings is placed separately to brutality, but that's only done so we can focus on each element in more detail. I will be as objective as I can be during the series, and I've researched as much as I can to show both sides of the argument where this is applicable, without going through any mental gymnastics and denial. Hear what I say.
There will be topics where I think ISIS are following Islam closely, and others where I think they may take some things in a cherry-picked fashion by seeming to ignore some credible sources.
Shall we repeat it?
There will be topics where I think ISIS are following Islam closely, and others where I think they may take some things in a cherry-picked fashion by seeming to ignore some credible sources.
Notice how only now, after I've said all this, is where his video picks up. Has he deliberately misled his audience into thinking I've claimed Islam unequivocally equals ISIS? That's the impression he's left his viewers, and that's the straw man he has built up when it's clearly not what I've repeatedly said from the very outset of this series. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the state of Muslim apologists today. Zero integrity in representing any opposing positions fairly. And if you thought his dishonesty couldn't get any worse, trust me, it does. See, this straw man has not gone unmentioned to Asadullah the iJihadi. Several people have asked him why he decided to misrepresent my position and attack a straw man by leaving out the opening part of the video, and he flat out refuses to acknowledge I said it. He probably knows his audience won't go and check my video because they're not that sophisticated if we're being honest, so he can get away with these endless lies. Let's read the exchange he had with Reason on Faith, shall we? To begin with, Reason on Faith really describes Asadullah's techniques very well. Asadullah, I find that repeatedly the method you employ is one of 1. False dichotomies, 2. Implanting motivations to others as if you have divine knowledge. I think that's a big sin in your religion called shirk, no. And 3. Misrepresenting people's statements so that you can do number 1 and number 2. But later on he says to him, several other points can be addressed, such as whether TMA even claimed Islam is synonymous with ISIS. He didn't. He only claimed that material in Islamic sources can be found that they can draw from to develop the positions they have. Now, my video was only 8 minutes long. This guy is telling you you've misrepresented my position by leaving this out altogether because it invalidates your entire refutation. So what does the iJihadi say? Will he admit that he's made a mistake? Will he retract his video? Or will he double down on his lies? Let's see. How can you possibly disagree? Nowhere does he state what you're claiming. He clearly thinks ISIS is drawing from authentic sources / teachings of Islam, not cherry-picking. But I just said those exact words. I said sometimes ISIS cherry-picks. This guy talks about people struggling with reading comprehension, but either he struggles with listening comprehension or he has zero integrity. And given that you've just been told exactly where to look, you've doubled down on your denial because you realize the consequences it has on your argument, and they are disastrous. Let's repeat what I said in my video once again for Asadullah to show his dishonesty in refusing to represent my position honestly.
There will be topics where I think ISIS are following Islam closely, and others where I think they may take some things in a cherry-picked fashion by seeming to ignore some credible sources.
See that? I said ISIS sometimes cherry-picks and ignores credible sources. Not only did he decide to start his video of me directly after I said this to deceive his audience into believing his straw man, but even when called out on it, he flat out lies about it. Anyway, let's now go back to his video and see how he commits another colossal straw man and yet another embarrassing error.
Terrorism and extremism.
Here I want to speak about these two issues in the general sense. Okay, did you hear what I just said? The very first sentence of my argument in this video says, here I want to speak about these two issues in the general sense. By referring to them in the general sense, I'm using terrorism as a verb, to terrorize, which is to inflict fear. That's the general sense of the term. I made this clear in the very first sentence I utter on this very topic, but what does the iJihadi prefer to do instead? Let's see. Terrorism in the Arabic language is irhab, and it comes from the root word rahaba. First question, does the Quran order its followers anywhere to use terrorism? The answer is yes. Chapter 8 verse 60 reads, "Against them make ready your strength to the utmost of your power, including steeds of war, to strike terror into the hearts of enemies of Allah and your enemies." In Arabic it reads, وَأَعِدُّوا لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ وَمِن رِبَاطِ الْخَيْلِ تُرْهِبُونَ بِهِ عَدُوَّ اللَّهِ وَعَدُوَّكُمْ. The word turhibuna here is terrorize. Another root word used in the Quran is ru'ab, which is translated to horror or terror. Chapter 8 verse 12 uses this word in a verse where Allah instructs the believers on how to fight the non-believers in battle. When your Lord revealed to the angels, I am with you. Therefore make firm those who believe. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. Therefore strike off their heads and strike off every fingertip of them.
At the very beginning of the masked Arab's argument, we already have a major problem. However, it's very subtle. In order to explain it, we need to start with the definition of terrorism, which is broadly defined as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Now, while it is true that the Arabic word for terrorism is irhab, it is literally impossible for any word in the Quran to be representative of this phenomenon. Why? Well, because the word terrorism wasn't coined until the late 18th century during the French Revolution. The term was coined by a political party called the Jacobins, who used it as a self-reference for their own policies.
So here he sets out on his straw man, completely ignoring the first sentence I uttered in relation to this term. Later in the video, I even suggest that the promise of hellfire could be identified as a form of terror because I was referring to the general meaning of the verb, whereas he builds a straw man to suggest I was referring to the modern meaning of the noun. Well done, what a great start. Just to be clear though, I'm not suggesting that our modern day definition of terrorism never applied in the Islamic world under Muhammad. It certainly did. What I'm pointing out is that he bases his entire videos on a straw man he builds by completely ignoring what I've said in my video. When we're looking at literal Quranic verses and their use of such words, it's referring to terror in the general sense. But once we see how classical Muslim scholars explain some verses of the Quran, they were describing the modern day phenomenon, as you'll soon see. He also seems to speak of terrorism in the English language and tries to look for its etymological roots there when the Quran is, as we all know, an Arabic text. What we should be looking for is the word irhab and its root words, which is exactly what I did. It's still meant to terrorize back then, so this whole argument is a complete red herring. To unpack this a bit more, let me give you this example. The word torture in Arabic is adab. Its root being the three letters, ayn, dal, ba. We find it in numerous places in the Quran. We find it at the beginning of chapter 24, which is Surah An-Nur, when the author of the Quran boasts about torturing those being punished for fornication by 100 lashes in front of a public crowd. And there are also numerous references to what the author vows will be torture in hellfire. Then, someone like the iJihadi comes along and claims that the specific English word for torture wasn't coined until the year 1540. By his logic, the mention of torture and torment in the Quran doesn't actually mean torture because the modern English equivalent of the word wasn't coined back then. He fails to take into account that languages evolve over time, some more quickly than others. For example, the Arabic language is one of the slowest to evolve over the past 1400 years, probably thanks to Muslims not wanting to step too far away from the roots of the classical language in order to help keep their understanding of scripture. At the time the Quran was revealed, English was worlds apart from what it is today. The top sentence here is what we now call Old English, and this was the version of English in use at the time of Islam's birth. So at the end of the day, the Arabic word for terrorize has kept its meaning since the birth of Islam. Chasing after the Western equivalent in order to strawman me and suggest that I meant the exact noun of the modern day phenomenon was mentioned in the Quran when I clearly said I was referring to the term in the general sense is a very poor start. Okay, I'm skipping this part, but it's around the 7-minute stage in his video if you're interested in seeing what it's about. Basically, he just keeps attacking the same straw man he built since the start of the argument.
Well, before going more in depth, let's allow the masked Arab to offer his explanation on the context behind these verses.
I'll undoubtedly hear people saying, out of context, So let's look into the context and see what Islam's biggest scholars said about the verses. If we look at the interpretation of this verse from one of Sunni Islam's most reputable commentaries on the Quran, the renowned scholar Ibn Kathir, we find inflicting fear on non-believers is sanctioned in verse 55 of chapter 8, according to Ibn Kathir. Allah states here that the worst moving creatures on the face of the earth are those who disbelieve. So, if you gain the mastery over them in war, if you defeat them and have victory over them in war, then disperse those who are behind them by severely punishing the captured people. This ayah commands punishing them harshly and inflicting casualties on them. This way, other enemies, Arabs and non-Arabs, will be afraid and take a lesson from their end. That, in a nutshell, pretty effectively describes the phenomena of terrorism as we see it in the world today, punishing people harshly in order to frighten others.
Here, the masked Arab relies on what is possibly considered one of the most reputable Quranic commentaries in the Muslim world, a tafsir by the 14th century scholar Ibn Kathir. However, the masked Arab's use of this tafsir is rather deceptive, and we need only examine the commentary ourselves to affirm this. First, let's take a look at the masked Arab's bibliography for this video. As you can see here, he references the tafsir and provides a link, but the commentary he provides is for chapter 8, verse 55, not for the verses he just mentioned prior, which were 8:12 and 8:60.
So here I mentioned the exegesis of Ibn Kathir, where he, in a nutshell, describes very well the concept of modern-day terrorism to explain a particular verse. The iJihad points out that the exegesis was for a different verse to the ones I cited earlier. That's true. I didn't notice this until now. It's not a huge deal. I often write my scripts for the Arabic version first, and in those versions I can use a lot more references as I'm not held back by the lack of translations for Quranic commentaries as I am with the English videos. Basically, the only commentaries we have translated in English that are reputable enough are Jalalain, which is very basic and brief and hardly ever goes into any detail, and Ibn Kathir, which is an abridged version of the Arabic original. That's pretty much it. The only other one we have a tiny bit of is that of Qurtubi, where we have translations for the first few chapters only. I'd love to see a full translation of Tabari's exegesis, but unfortunately, I don't think it exists yet. If you were to check the Arabic version of the same video, you'll see I actually used Tabari to show the context behind chapter 8 verse 60, which is one of the verses I cited. So this argument only applies to the English version because I'm limited to what I can show you in English given the lack of translations available. But this is yet another red herring, and we're only 10 minutes into the video. Instead of trying to refute the statements made in Ibn Kathir's tafsir, he simply points out I quoted the commentary for another verse without attempting to tackle the massive problems in the commentary we just read. The commentary here still exists, and it's still part of the Quran, even if I didn't quote the passage earlier. Let's quote it now if it triggered you so much. It's not as if I was hiding anything peaceful, I can tell you that. What does 8:55 read? Surely the vilest of animals in Allah's sight are those who disbelieve. Then they would not believe. So Ibn Kathir goes on to explain how infidels are so vile and how they should be dealt with.
So not only does he neglect to show the commentary for these verses, but he also neglects to mention the introductory commentary for the entire chapter, or surah. And why is this a problem? Well, because Ibn Kathir openly contradicts the masked Arab's interpretation of these verses. Going straight to the website the masked Arab uses, we find the following introductory commentary for this surah. Al-Bukhari recorded that Ibn Abbas said, Al-Anfal are the spoils of war.
Wait, what? Al-Anfal? Come again?
Al-Bukhari also recorded that Sa'id bin Jubair said, I said to Ibn Abbas, Surat Al-Anfal, he said.
Jeez, Asadullah's butchering that pronunciation. It's not pronounced Surat Al-Anfal. It's pronounced Surat Al-Anfal. I wouldn't usually be harsh on a non-Arab's inability to pronounce the names of chapters in the Quran, but since you view yourself as every Islamophobe's nightmare, I'll make an exception. So maybe first learn how to pronounce the names of the 114 chapters in the Quran before coming to the big boys table.
It was revealed concerning the Battle of Badr. Imam Ahmed recorded that Abu Umama said that Ubadah bin As-Samat said, We went with the Messenger of Allah ﷺ to the Battle of Badr. When the two armies met, Allah defeated the enemy and some of us pursued them, inflicting utter defeat and casualties. From the introductory commentary alone, it's apparent that this entire surah makes zero reference to the phenomenon of terrorism, because it's specifically talking about two opposing armies. In other words, the disbelievers mentioned in 8:55 concern military combatants only, not some random non-Muslims that just happen to be walking around minding their own business.
So he claims that Ibn Kathir openly contradicts me. How so? Because he says this chapter was revealed about a battle, And how does this contradict me exactly? Does terrorism never happen during times of war? When ISIS was battling the coalition fighting it, did it not commit any terrorism because it was all done during times of battle? Is this really your logic? Are you suggesting that terrorism can only ever be against civilians? Does this mean that you don't think ISIS burning the Jordanian pilot, who was a combatant, was an act of terror, simply because he wasn't a civilian? Do you think ISIS massacring the cadets at Spiker Base in Iraq was not an act of terror? Spit it out. Show us your true colours, iJihadi. Be honest. Also, when Ibn Kathir says the chapter was revealed concerning the Battle of Badr, he doesn't mean every single verse was revealed that way. Listen carefully again to what the iJihadi claims.
From the introductory commentary alone, it's apparent that this entire surah makes zero reference to the phenomenon of terrorism, because it's specifically talking about two opposing armies.
This is yet another embarrassing blunder by the iJihadi. He just claimed that the entire surah made zero reference to terrorism because he misread the commentary of Ibn Kathir as meaning, and I quote, the entire surah was about the Battle of Badr. The iJihadi here seems to be clueless about some of the most basic facts of Islamic history. He is either unaware of what the surah actually says, or he doesn't understand the basic timeline of Islamic history as given to us by the Sunnah. This is painfully obvious if you read verses 30 to 35 in that same chapter, Surah Al-Anfal, not Al-Anfal, which he says references Badr alone. These verses were clearly talking about events in Mecca and not in Medina, way before the Battle of Badr. Maybe the iJihadi doesn't realize that the Battle of Badr happened after the migrations of Muslims to Medina, otherwise he wouldn't have suggested that the whole chapter was referring to Badr. When Ibn Kathir says this, he talks about the bulk of the chapter and not all of it. So once again, very sloppy usage of what he calls facts that only shows he hasn't at all grasped the introductory commentary and jumped to ridiculous conclusions without checking the verses contained within the chapter.
Now, while we will be discussing the nature and details of this battle in a subsequent episode, for those who wish to argue that because these verses say the disbelievers, it therefore means all disbelievers, allow me to give you a brief lesson on how grammar works. You see, there are these things called definite articles, and they usually refer back to a more specific person, place, or thing. In other words, they don't always refer to a universal subject. For example, if I said that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor during World War II, it would be obvious that I'm not referring to all Japanese people, but specifically the Japanese military during World War II. No one with any semblance of intelligence would think otherwise. Likewise, if I said that the Americans defeated the Germans in World War II, no one would assume I meant every single American or every single German citizen. Such nuance applies even more so to cases of demonstrative and relative pronouns. So, if this is going to be your counter-response, I beg you, please, spare your brain cells.
Wow, okay. I agree with what you just said in general. So if I said the Muslims kill innocent civilians over and over and over again in bomb attacks and rape Yazidi women, I'm expecting you to jump to my defense if I get criticized for that statement because I never said every single Muslim at the beginning of that sentence. Right? No, you wouldn't defend me for making that statement. And why not? Are you selective in your application of how the definite article should be understood? Should I make clear that I didn't mean every single Muslim? Yes? Well, maybe the Quran should also make it clear here too. That's surely not too much to ask, is it? Let's try another example for you. If I said, kill the Muslims wherever you find them, when there's an inevitable backlash against my disgusting hypothetical statement, would it suffice for me to say, no, I didn't say every single Muslim. When I said kill the Muslims wherever you find them, I meant those 30 Muslims over there about to run at us with suicide bomb vests. Will you immediately make up similar excuses for my bold statements? No? Didn't think so. Once again, your argument tells us that Muhammad failed miserably in the one job he had, which is to pass on a message clearly.
The masked Arab's deceptive use of this commentary becomes even more apparent in the following clip.
I'd like to ask any Muslims this question regarding the latter part of this verse. It asks the believers to cast terror into the hearts of infidels and strike off their heads and their fingertips. But which one do you do first? Are you supposed to chop off the head first and then chop off the fingertips, or do you chop off the fingertips first? Either way, this is horrific and it's straight from the Quran. If you chop off the head first and then go for the fingertips, then you're just mutilating a dead body. If it's done the other way around and you chop off the fingers first and then the head, then you're just torturing people before killing them. What's the purpose here of mutilation or torture? Please explain how you can accept this verse and which one you think goes first. Then tell us why you think the mutilation or torture is merited. If you want to argue that they're done at the same time, then what's the point of going for the fingertips? What purpose does that serve?
Well, that's a lovely question. However, I don't really understand why he's asking his audience to answer it when he has a commentary on hand that he considers to be of the utmost reliability.
Yet another straw man. I've never said I personally consider Ibn Kathir to be of the utmost reliability. I've said mainstream Muslims consider it to be one of the best tafsirs out there, along with Tabari and a few others. I don't regard any of Islam's primary sources to be quote-unquote of the utmost reliability, and that includes the Quran. I don't think that it was perfectly preserved or that it necessarily all came from a man called Muhammad. I don't hold the authentic hadiths in any particular sacred light either. I use them to make a point to Muslims who do consider these sources as credible. So, yet another misrepresentation.
So let's read what Ibn Kathir has to say about this verse. Allah's statement, "I will cast terror into the hearts of those who have disbelieved," means, you, angels, support the believers, strengthen their battlefront against their enemies, thus implementing my command to you. I will cast fear, disgrace, and humiliation over those who defied my command and denied my messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Arabi bin Anas said, in the aftermath of Badr, the people used to recognize whomever the angels killed from those whom they killed by the wounds over their necks, fingers, and toes, because those parts had a mark as if they were branded by fire. So if it wasn't already apparent, this verse is not a direct command to Muslims, but to the angels in support of the Muslims during a military conflict. It's even stated in the verse itself.
I never said Muslims here, I said believers. I'm not going to accuse you of strawmanning me on this occasion, as I think it's a subtle difference you may not have noticed. I worded it that way because angels and Muslims are both believers in God and Islam according to your own mythology. And according to the tafsirs, this instruction can be understood as a command for either, depending on the exegete in question. So saying believers would include both. Of course, the iJihadi is once again clueless to the fact that this can be an instruction to humans, as we'll soon see, recently stating that it's not even debatable and an issue for good old reading comprehension. Yet he can't even read Arabic as far as I'm aware. The sentence can be broken down to mean the instruction is in fact given to humans and not angels. Don't take my word for it. Just go to the classical Muslim scholars and you'll see this is the case. I don't think he's deliberately hiding this from his audience, I just think he's completely ignorant when it comes to what the exegetes actually say on the verse. Another reason he should be a bit more humble. On Twitter he calls anyone who claims it's anything but an instruction to angels as an idiot. In that case, some of Islam's most prominent exegetes were idiots too. People like Al-Akhfash, Al-Dhahhak and Atiyah, who all said it was an instruction given to humans and not angels. We can see this opinion being given in the tafsir of Qurtubi where he says, therefore strike off their heads. This is an instruction for the angels, but it's also said to be an instruction for the Muslim believers to strike at the necks. This was said by Al-Akhfash, Al-Dhahhak and Atiyah. The tafsir of Baghawi, which is highly recommended by Ibn Taymiyyah, says the following, therefore strike off their heads. It was said that this was an instruction for the Muslim believers, and was also said it was an instruction for the angels. If we go to the exegesis of Tabari, we see he gives a number of opinions, but then he gives his own verdict too. What was his verdict, I hear you ask? Let's read it, shall we? The sensible way to interpret this is to say God commanded the Muslim believers to teach them the way to kill the polytheists and striking them with their swords above their necks and their hands and feet. We can see clearly from numerous examples of major scholars that this issue is not understood exclusively to be an instruction for the angels as the iJihadi has falsely claimed. So, an epic fail once again.
As for the reason for them attacking those particular body parts, it was to show the Muslims that they were being supported by divine intervention. Now, a non-Muslim doesn't have to believe this story if they don't want to. That's perfectly fine. However, to claim that this verse is a command to Muslims to torture and mutilate non-combatants is simply false.
Notice here how he strawmans me yet again. He says I claimed this was a command to mutilate and torture non-combatants. When did I ever say this was a command to torture and mutilate non-combatants? If that were the case, I would have put it in my killing innocent civilians video. A gentle reminder for you, if you constantly need to build a straw man to attack my positions, it means your arguments are incredibly weak, necessitating the use of such dishonest methods.
Even the secondary interpretation of this verse, which suggests that it may be a command to the Muslims, does not promote any sort of torture or mutilation of non-combatants. but simply states that Muslims aim for every part of their enemies' bodies during, once again, military conflict.
And he's now just repeating the same shitty straw man. But did you notice what else he did? Here he directly contradicts himself a few moments earlier by acknowledging that other interpretations saying this was a command to the Muslims and not the angels do exist. Remember, only a minute earlier he said,
So if it wasn't already apparent, this verse is not a direct command to Muslims, but to the angels in support of the Muslims during a military conflict.
He can't seem to remain consistent even within a single minute. Anyway, what else does he have for us?
Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think any civilized ethic of warfare prohibits the targeting of certain body parts during battle. I mean, if all you had was a sword, I also don't think you'd be wary of chopping at your opponent's hands, seeing as that would probably be a very effective tactic. Just saying.
A literal reading of the verse, as well as commentaries by exegetes such as Tabari, lead us to the conclusion I cited. So if you're saying it actually means something else, then you're simply saying the Quran isn't a perfect scripture, given how its purpose is to give its followers clear instructions on everything, but fails to do this pretty much all the time.
And it doesn't take much effort to realize that all this is implying is that Muslims should not hold back in the heat of battle. That's it. It's not asking them to walk up to their enemies, hold them down, and then proceed to amputate specific body parts during battle. To even suggest such a thing would be absolutely ludicrous.
I do agree. The Quran is in fact ludicrous. Not just here though, but in plenty of places. Whatever explanations you have for this come from exegetes and not the literal reading of the actual Quranic verse. The exegetes also differ on what is meant by it, but the iJihadi has once again gone with one interpretation and left out all the others which disagree with his statement. We saw earlier that Tabari supports the interpretation that you target the neck and also target the hands and feet, and that it was a command to Muslims. He also mentions the feet because he interprets it as including toes and not solely the fingers. So that blows your entire, "ooh, it's for practical purposes," straight out of the window. Here it is again on screen for you. But what's more, he goes into more detail on the issue of finger and toe chopping. Let's read some more from Tabari on the issue, which I'm glad we both agree is ludicrous. Allah's saying, strike off every fingertip of them means the believers need to strike their enemies every joint in their hands and feet. The word banan means the fingers of the hand and the toes of the feet. So we've just seen the iJihadi try to mock me for pointing out the absurd nature of this verse. He tried to claim that it doesn't say anything of the sort, and yet when we read what arguably is the biggest exegete of the Quran, it comes off even worse, as he also talks about chopping off toes, so he's mocking his own holy books without even realizing it. Anyway, moving on.
Moving on, the masked Arab then attempts to supplement his erroneous interpretations with some narrations from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
What was that?
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Sorry, I'm just getting distracted now. It's just funny why these converts try so hard to copy Arabs. Just say peace be upon him. It's an English video after all.
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Let's see what Muhammad himself said in the most authentic hadiths or sayings attributed to him. Allah's Messenger said, "I have been sent with the shortest expressions bearing the widest meanings, and I have been made victorious with terror cast in the heart of the enemy." In another hadith, he says something similar. The Messenger of Allah said, "I have been given superiority over the other prophets in 6 respects. I have been given words which are concise but comprehensive in meaning. I have been helped by terror in the hearts of the enemies." So there we had several examples of the word terrorism and terrorize being used in Islamic sources.
Once again, these statements require the very same context as the previous Quranic verses. If the enemies in question are combatants, as I think has already been established, then this shouldn't startle anyone other than some delusional pacifist. So what does the masked Arab expect Muslims to do during war? What, try to comfort our enemies by handing out flowers and chocolates? Or perhaps we should resort to taunting them like Frenchmen.
"If you will not show us the Grail, we shall take your castle by force."
"You don't frighten us, English pig dogs! Go and boil your bottom, sons of a silly person! Blow my nose at you, so-called Arthur King! You and all your silly English kniggets!" What a strange person.
I like how he just brushes over all this so quickly and then presents a false dichotomy in a silly clip in order to try and completely ignore the hadiths that completely shatter his entire argument. Firstly, neither of those hadiths suggested anywhere that it was referring only to combatants. If you are going to make that claim, then you need to have the hadith say something of the sort. You can't just pull it out of thin air. Crying out of context when the hadith itself makes no mention of any context that makes it exclusively for combatants is not an argument. And as if he hasn't already set a new world record in the accumulation of logical fallacies throughout his disastrous abortion of a rebuttal, he goes on to provide us with a rather cute false dichotomy. A false dichotomy he will keep repeating because he has no actual arguments. Either you are a pacifist who won't even defend himself, or you use terror. No options apparently exist for purely advocating self-defense and maintaining ethics during wartime. Nope, no such options exist. It's either the most ridiculous form of pacifism or terror. But even with this absurd false dichotomy, his arguments still fail once more. You see, in the second hadith, we see Muhammad saying that these attributes were given distinctly to him and not to other prophets, and these included the use of terror. So is the iJihadi claiming that no single other prophet ever had to fight? Were they all pacifists according to his genius dichotomy? If that's the case, does this mean that Muhammad is just more troublesome than the others? Does it mean he resorted to violence quicker than any of his predecessors? Either way, nothing here bodes well for your prophet, and simply brushing it off as a dichotomy between waging terror and pacifism once again shows your deceptive tactics. Or by this stage, it could just be stupidity. I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt by assuming you've been deceptive.
Moving on, let's look at how the masked Arab defines extremism in the final part of this video.
But what about extremism? The word for an extremist is mutashaddid. A variation of this word, ashidda, appears in chapter 48 verse 29 as a command on how to behave with non-Muslims. In the interpretation of this verse by Jalalain, we read the following. Muhammad is the messenger of God, and those who are with him, that is, his companions from among the believers, are hard, tough against the believers, showing them no mercy, but merciful amongst themselves. In chapter 9 verse 123, we find another instruction on how to treat non-Muslims. It tells us, O ye who believe, fight those of the disbelievers who are near to you, and let them find harshness in you, and know that Allah is with those who keep their duty unto Him. In chapter 5 verse 54 we see this instruction, as explained by Ibn Kathir. Allah will bring a people whom He will love, and they will love Him. Humble towards the believers, stern towards the disbelievers. This is the description of the believers, harsh with the disbelievers, merciful and kind to the believers, angry without smiling before the disbelievers, smiling and beaming with pleasure before his believing brother.
This isn't entirely correct. You see, unlike English, Arabic has far more ways to say the word extremist and even more ways for it to be understood. While religious extremism can be represented by the word mutashaddid, it generally has a non-violent connotation.
So here he says extremism doesn't necessarily mean violence. I never said extremism always resulted in violence. Yet another straw man, he can't seem to help himself.
You see, the word is derived from the word tashaddud, which has a variety of meanings in and of itself, including but not limited to the following: forced hardness, firmness, strength, vigor, hardiness, courage, vehemence, severity, strictness, rigor, etc. In other words, while the word may denote an aspect of extremism, it doesn't usually refer to acts of violence. The type of extremist that the masked Arab seems to be talking about is someone who reaches or goes beyond the bounds of a moral or ideological standard, and would probably be better represented by the term mutatarraf, which is derived from the word tatarruf. That aside, the masked Arab once again neglects to show whether these verses are addressing civilians or military combatants, and by this point, I believe he's doing so deliberately. Why? Well, first notice how he no longer relies on Ibn Kathir when attempting to explain Surah 48 verse 29. Rather, he references Imam Suyuti, the 15th to 16th century scholar who co-wrote a more vague commentary by the name of Tafsir al-Jalalain. He then goes on to mention Surah 9 verse 123, but curiously doesn't attach any commentary at all. And then he does something even more peculiar. He mentions Surah 5 verse 54 within Ibn Kathir's tafsir, as a supplement to his commentary on Surah 48 verse 29. Yes, that's right. The masked Arab is quoting a verse within the commentary of another verse.
Oh, this is so ridiculous. He's really clutching at straws now. desperate for a gotcha moment. Does he really think by saying, yes, that's right, he just read the tafsir of Ibn Kathir, was somehow going to impress anyone out there with more than 3 brain cells? Firstly, I'm not the one quoting another verse from inside this verse. Ibn Kathir is. And there's nothing wrong with him using examples from other verses to help provide more context to the present verse. It's so ridiculous that he thinks this is somehow a gotcha. Let's listen to this stable genius again.
Yes, that's right. The masked Arab is quoting a verse within the commentary of another verse.
Well, actually, Your Honor, it was Ibn Kathir, but what the heck, who cares? I'm guilty as charged. Lock me up for reading the tafsir of Ibn Kathir the way he wrote it. Anyway, let's see what other crimes I'm guilty of here.
You need only go to the website he uses, select Surah 4829, and then click on the subsequent page to see where he derives this reference.
My, what a scandal.
So why does the masked Arab suddenly decide to use a new reference while censoring Ibn Kathir? Why not be more consistent and at least use the same ever so credible commentary for these specific passages? You know, so as to remain objective? Well, the answer is quite simple. Because the masked Arab knows that Ibn Kathir contradicts him, and he wants to hide what he has to say on the matter, while still keeping a veneer of objectivity.
Well done on yet another dumb conspiracy. You claim I'm censoring Ibn Kathir simply because I cited one of 2 tafsirs available to me in the English language, and on this occasion, you thought the other one represented your argument better. Well, again, lock me up for not citing every single tafsir in the world for my 8-minute video. My whole point in doing the series is to prove the point that ISIS can have legitimacy from primary Islamic sources. I can quote those primary Islamic sources and not necessarily every single one just for the sake of it. This shows that there are plausible ways for ISIS to justify what they do using such sources. That was the whole aim of the series. I never claimed this is the only way these verses should be understood. So far, you've been arguing against a straw man for the entire video because you don't seem to grasp this point. Or you prefer to score points with a childish audience who are not bright enough to call you out on any of these fallacies you keep repeating throughout your rebuttals. It's also ironic how he complains about me not using Ibn Kathir for the verse on the left, and then complains about me using Ibn Kathir in the one on the right. Apparently, I have to use whichever tafsir has the most peaceful interpretation, and that's it. I can't show anyone where ISIS can get their ideas from. No, that would be haram. Also, notice how once again he simply ignores what is written by Ibn Kathir because he made you all chase the red herring by citing conspiracy theories. Let's read it again, shall we? Allah will bring a people with whom He will love and they will love Him, humble towards the believers, stern towards the disbelievers. This is the description of the believers, harsh with the disbelievers, merciful and kind to the believers, angry without smiling before the disbelievers, smiling and beaming with pleasure before his believing brother. Are we meant to understand that this is only the behavior that you give enemy combatants and not non-Muslim civilians? Why? It doesn't say this in the exegesis. He has jumped through hoops and gone to other verses, some of which are now abrogated, as you'll soon see, to try and prove his point. But if he's looking for more evidence that Islam orders you to treat non-Muslims like garbage, let me show you this authentic hadith. Allah's Messenger said, "Do not greet the Jews and the Christians before they greet you, and when you meet any of them on the roads, force him to go to the narrowest part of it." Is this also against people in battle? It sure as hell doesn't sound like it.
As a case in point, when we examine Ibn Kathir's commentary on Surah 9 verse 123, we find that he clearly refers to military conflict. O you who believe, fight those of the disbelievers who are close to you, Allah said next, and let them find harshness in you, meaning, let the disbelievers find harshness in you against them in battle. The complete believer is he who is kind to his believing brother and harsh with his disbelieving enemy. And Surah 5 verse 54 is used here as a supplement.
A few things to note here. He just cited Ibn Kathir and we find there to be a supplement of another verse. The same thing he found so outrageous a moment ago. But here is where it gets interesting. iJihad seems to have gone into full-on conspiracy nutjob mode, trying to yet again smear my intentions as if I was deliberately hiding this information from my viewers. And why is this claim a lie? Well, you see, the very same verse he accuses me of allegedly hiding because it says this was done in battle is the very same verse I cite Tabari for in my Arabic video on the topic. My Arabic video has the exact same point he thinks I'm scared of. This is a screenshot of my video, and this on screen tells you that this was against infidel fighters. I'm not hiding anything. It's there for the audience that can read Arabic because it's a tafsir in Arabic. No conspiracy here. Unlike you, I'm not happy with the extreme harshness towards my enemy, even if they were combatants.
And if this wasn't enough, it gets worse.
Oh yes, it does get worse. But not for me. It gets much worse for you.
Because the Quran and Ibn Kathir are very, very explicit regarding the treatment of civilians. Something that the mass Arab, once again, has refused to mention.
Well, unlike a sleazy lying apologist, I can't mention something that's not true. Whether you like it or not, the Quran is not very specific at all on the treatment of civilians. You may find some vague guidelines in some passages that have pretty much been abrogated. Let's also see how you define the term civilian. Will it include people like me? Will it include people like him as his younger, non-believing former self? Are we classified as civilians by his definition? Let's see, shall we?
For example, the Quran states in the following 2 verses of Surah 60, Allah does not forbid you to deal kindly and justly with anyone who has not fought you for your faith or driven you out of your homes. Allah loves the just. Allah only forbids you to take as allies those who have fought against you for your faith, driven you out of your homes, and helped others to drive you out. Any of you who take them as allies will truly be wrongdoers. Thus, the Quran makes it explicitly clear that the only people who are to be treated with harshness are those who actively persecute the Muslims, fighting them and driving them out from their homes. Now, one may retort that these verses were abrogated by later verses, which seem to advocate all-out war against every single disbeliever, whether they be soldiers or civilians.
Okay, so you're accepting that there are exegetes out there who say this was abrogated. So you've already debunked yourself. What's the point of continuing with this argument? Are you going to show us one example of someone saying it isn't? Don't you see the problem of quoting abrogated verses as if they're still universally accepted as binding when they clearly aren't?
More specifically, one might mention Surah 9, verse 5. When the 4 forbidden months are over, wherever you encounter the idolaters, kill them, seize them, besiege them, wait for them at every lookout post. But if they turn to Allah, maintain the prayer, and pay the prescribed alms, let them go on their way, for Allah is most forgiving and merciful. At a later point in this episode, we'll discuss this verse in more detail, but in the meantime, let's address this counter-argument, once again using the masked Arab's very own references. Firstly, it should be noted that neither Ibn Kathir nor Imam Suyuti claim that the 2 verses in Surah 60 were abrogated. More importantly, however, Ibn Kathir openly states his opposition to the idea that Surah 9 verse 5 abrogates previous passages. He makes this clear in his commentary on Surah 2 190 to 191, where he states the following.
Whoa, hold up. Remember that only a few minutes earlier he made a massive deal out of me using the tafsir of another verse to make a point about a verse I was on. In my case, it was Ibn Kathir himself who had laid out his commentary in that way. Here, the iJihadi does the exact same thing he had a massive problem with only a minute ago. But here he goes to another verse all on his own. It's not even referenced within the verse he's talking about. Now, to be clear, I don't have a problem with him doing this at all because it's not a big deal. But it seems this guy has zero self-awareness and does the exact same thing he himself had an issue with only a few minutes ago.
And fight in the way of Allah those who fight you. Abu al-Aliyah said, this was the first ayah about fighting that was revealed in Al-Madinah. Ever since it was revealed, Allah's Messenger ﷺ used to fight only those who fought him and avoid non-combatants.
So you're reading opinions cited by Ibn Kathir that he doesn't necessarily agree with, yet opinions nonetheless by exegetes prior to him who saw this as a command to kill civilians. So you're just making my argument for me by showing that this interpretation was out there, and this is how some scholars understood the Quran. Once again, you've just debunked your entire video once more. But let's see where he goes with this. I think he's going to tell us that Ibn Kathir didn't think this was the correct opinion, which only tells us that it was a matter of dispute in interpretation.
Later, Surah 9 was revealed. Abdurrahman bin Zayd bin Aslam said similarly. Then he said that this was later abrogated by the ayah, then kill them wherever you find them. However, this statement is not plausible, because Allah's statement, those who fight you, applies only to fighting the enemies who are engaged in fighting Islam and its people. So the ayah means, fight those who fight you. Just as Allah said in another ayah, and fight against the mushrikeen collectively as they fight against you collectively.
So here his entire argument is based on the words, however, this statement is not plausible. He believes this is what Ibn Kathir actually said. And Ibn Kathir wrote his tafsir in Arabic and not English. So let's see whether this sentence, which he bases his whole argument on, exists in the Arabic text of his commentary. Here it is, the exact same portion of Ibn Kathir. And what does it say? There's only one word here that was somehow translated to that big sentence, and that word is nadar, which simply means opinion. In this context, it would have made much more sense to translate this as an alternative opinion, rather than, however, this statement is not plausible, which adds in numerous words that are nowhere to be seen in the original. I don't know whether this was mistranslated on purpose. I know there are many instances of clearly dishonest translations, but I can't blame the iJihadi for thinking this is what Ibn Kathir said, when he actually said something far from it. I think he, like the vast majority of Muslims, cannot speak the Arabic language, and that's fair enough.
He then goes on to say, "But transgress not the limits. Truly, Allah likes not the transgressors." This ayah means fight for the sake of Allah and do not be transgressors, such as by committing prohibitions. Al-Hasan al-Basri stated that transgression, indicated by this ayah, includes mutilating the dead, theft from captured goods, killing women, children, and old people who do not participate in warfare, killing priests and residents of houses of worship, burning down trees, and killing animals without real benefit.
And here it is for all to see, ladies and gentlemen. I rest my case once again. Do you remember when only a minute ago he told us the Quran and Ibn Kathir were incredibly clear on the treatment of civilians? I asked whether I or him as his former disbelieving self would count as a civilian by his standards. Clearly, we're not civilians. Just read the list of prohibitions he cites as being super clear on what to do with civilians. Killing women, children, and old people who do not participate in warfare. So firstly, you're allowed to kill them if they are deemed to be participating in warfare. But civilian men are strangely missing from this list. Are we not considered civilians? Why not? Is your definition of civilian solely women, children, and the elderly? You see how this is a huge problem that the Quran doesn't seem to be addressing. What about non-Muslim civilian men? Why the omission? You brush over this as if you hadn't noticed the glaring problem. Anyway, once more, your argument fails from the very sources you are using to try and prove your point.
As such, it should be obvious by this point that the masked Arab isn't acting innocently with these omissions.
Sure.
More formally speaking, what the masked Arab is doing here is committing the fallacy of suppressed evidence, where he has purposefully excluded information to suit his own agenda.
No projection here whatsoever.
This is also commonly referred to as cherry picking. So I'd say this is a pretty bad start for such a major exposé produced by an apparent authority on the subject. But can the masked Arab salvage this mess? Well, let's move on to his second video where he argues that Islam condones the killing of innocent civilians.
So here he moves on to the second video, which I'll address separately as this video has already become ridiculously long. But let's for a second watch some actual cherry picking in action.
When you pick cherries, basically you go for color, and the darker the red, the riper the fruit. Orange cherries will not quite, they're not quite mature, they're not quite ripe yet. These right here are perfect, they're red, they're good size, so basically you just put your hand underneath and just give them a slight pull, and they come off very easily when they're ripe.
I also find it surprising how a Muslim can ever complain of cherry picking when it comes to the Quran. If it were indeed a perfect book, you would be happy to have any verse cited to you, and not just cry cherry picking if the verse you quote is indefensible. Imagine if we all cried cherry picking when we get called out on all the nasty stuff we say. Let's imagine for a second that I had a tweet saying, "Kill Muslims wherever you find them," and then you rightly highlighted it as evidence that I was inciting violence towards Muslims. Can I say, "Hey, wait a second, you're cherry picking. I have over 4,000 tweets and you just selected that one nasty one"? Would you be convinced that my horrendous tweet was okay if I showed you another one which was a lot nicer? No? That's alright, because I'm a human being and I'm still accountable for the stuff I say. To set an even lower standard for an allegedly perfect God is absolutely absurd. Crying about cherry picking suggests you don't feel it's perfect. It suggests you're uncomfortable with certain passages, making it far from the perfect work Muslims claim it to be. How often do we hear Muslims citing passages like "there is no compulsion of religion" and doing it completely out of context? And how often do we hear them boastfully citing passages like the one about beating your wife? We know Muslims are definitely more comfortable citing one passage more than the other, but that shouldn't really be the case if your book is entirely perfect. So here we reach the end of his rebuttal to the first video of the series, and to recap, so far he's failed miserably with his rebuttal while repeatedly giving us one fallacy after another. He labels himself every Islamophobe's nightmare and likes his own videos, indicating how insecure he is, requiring constant self-praise to feed his ego. He began critiquing my 8-minute video from the 3-minute mark, crucially missing out several elements in order to completely misrepresent my position and intention for the series. He has misled his viewers into thinking that I've been claiming ISIS is 100% following Islam to the letter, when my series and even my first episode clearly say I thought they sometimes cherry-picked and ignored some credible sources in my opinion. But unlike him, I don't pretend they have nothing to do with Islam, when so much of what they do is plainly supported in primary Islamic texts. He was called out for this and refuses to be honest about his misrepresentations, doubling down and claiming I never said ISIS can cherry-pick when I said that immediately before the moment he decided to start with critiquing my video. Incredibly disingenuous. The rest was only downhill from there. Strawman after strawman, where he continues to argue things I've never claimed or said, and he threw in plenty of red herrings too, where he chased around for evidence that doesn't even support his positions. For example, he fails to understand the opening commentary for Ibn Kathir's analysis of Surat al-Anfal, or Surat al-Anfal as he likes to call it. He thinks the entire chapter is about the Battle of Badr, something that he would only claim if he never read the chapter, or was utterly clueless in very, very basic Islamic history. He then brings his evidence of his go-to peaceful verse, and surprise, surprise, it turns out to be abrogated. Then he moves on to a conspiracy that I deliberately hid information from my viewers, something that is completely false, and the same information he claims I hid was actually in my Arabic version of the video, making the exact same point he thought I was so terrified of showing. The reason why it was in the Arabic video is because I found it in Tafsir al-Tabari, which doesn't have an English translation. He then goes and commits more fallacies, throwing false dichotomies in there too. He also uses an incorrect translation to prop up a pathetically weak argument that still fails when you realize what the original says. I'll try to do the next video addressing his critique of my second video whenever I get a chance. I'm incredibly busy, as you can probably see from the lack of activity on my main channel over the past year, but I will try to put something together. The next two should hopefully be a little shorter in duration, as you should all now be familiar with his deceptive use of apologetics and smears. If you thought this was bad and can't get any worse for Asadullah the iJihadi, trust me, it gets worse. So what can we expect from this apologist now? Well, if you engage him, he may block you, and it might be even quicker than the 15 minutes it took to block somebody else the other day. He may threaten to send you to your god, or send your name and links to your critiques of Islam to the nearest mosque or Islamic society group. He may try and desperately smear me even more, or even decide to smear some more people. He'll definitely strawman you and throw in irrelevant red herrings as he desperately tries to justify his ridiculous arguments. One thing you will never see from him is an attempt to speak to people respectfully and engage in any form of debate that tackles substance without smears and misrepresentations. One thing you will definitely see, however, is his constant need to be a 24/7 douchebag and insult anyone who dare question His Royal Highness. This insulting nature only goes to show that he knows his arguments do not stand up to any scrutiny, and it's a way for him to convince his childish audience of this. That's it. Let's just look at a few examples, because this is all he does. And it's for this reason that he's an utter joke. He opens his response to a comment that absolutely schooled him with, you guessed it, "You've always struck me as a bit of a moron." He tells another person, "I didn't even bother to read the rest of your inane writing after that. I think I'd like to preserve what brain cells I have left after struggling through the absurdity I just witnessed." Here somebody is actually trying to have a conversation with him, but for some reason Asadullah does a Reza Aslan, tells us about how much time he's wasted at universities, given that this is the ultimate result. Yes, I am a Muslim. However, I also have 2 degrees in philosophy, wrote my master's dissertation on the flaws of epistemic evidentialism, can read Latin and Greek moderately well, have delved into the ontological views of Heidegger. And then Sheikh Monkfish comes back with, "I am aware that you are very impressed with yourself. Good for you." So what does he come back with, Asadullah? "No, what you're aware of is that I'm more educated than you, and all you got are a bunch of trollish barbs to compensate for your stupidity. Now let's have a debate on philosophy here so I can show everyone how much of a peasant you are." That comment we just read really shows he has zero self-awareness. He doesn't understand the irony of accusing others of making trollish barbs to compensate for their stupidity, which is exactly what he does all the time. So anyway, Sheikh Monkfish, trying to get this back on track, says either you are going to say something of interest or you are not. And then this guy continues, and you will continue evading any real discussion because you know as well as I do that you're just a pathetic, impotent troll incapable of even basic reasoning, and that I would humiliate you and drag your name across my page like a useless trophy through the mud. Sheikh Montfish says, that's a knot then. Oh wow, this guy, I don't even think the title douchebag does him any justice. Finally, here he arrogantly dismisses any potential critic of his video. There is no real response I expect from him or any of his supporters. The facts speak for themselves. Anyone who denies what I've presented here is either delusional, lying, or an idiot. There are no other options. Okay, well done. You're a very humble person. Finally, I have someone who wishes to explain to the juvenile and pretentious Asadullah why calling everyone who disagrees with him an idiot doesn't actually work. He's here to tell you that we can see through your bullshit. Allow me to introduce Kevin, or Asadullah when he was a Christian before he converted to Islam. You can see that from the cross he's wearing in the video around his neck, and notice how different he was in his tone. I wonder what turned this seemingly pleasant guy into the aggressive, fanatical, and obnoxious man-child he is today. Listen to your younger self, boy, and have some humility.
You know, it's blatantly obvious that there's a lot of degrading going on and insulting, and if you really wanted to persuade somebody, you don't go around doing that. You know, a lot of people try to justify their behavior towards people they disagree with by saying, well, you know, this is just our way of doing it. You know, this is to get our message across and to get them thinking. Well, if you think they're too stupid to think about what you're doing or to think about your arguments, then what's the point? I mean, you're calling them stupid, you know, irrational, deluded, mentally unstable. And then, you know, you throw them an argument and you think that, you know, it's supposed to do something. You know, after you've just claimed that their intelligence is far below yours. So, you know, that's a really good way of doing it. Hint, that doesn't work. Okay?